Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back all the way to ancient Rome. So go ahead, settle into bed, dim the lights, and let your eyelids grow heavy. This won't be exciting. In fact, it's probably going to be one of the dullest explorations of Roman daily life you'll ever hear. And that's exactly what you came here for. Because when most people think about Rome, they imagine emperors waving their arms dramatically, gladiators screaming in the Colosseum, and senators plotting in marble halls. But tonight, we're skipping all of that noisy drama. Instead, we're going to wander quietly down the back alleys, past the crumbling taverns, into the sticky little rooms where Roman prostitutes spent their days. And to be clear, if you're imagining this as glamorous, seductive, or anything remotely fun, don't. This is Rome, the city that made plumbing but never quite worked out, so their brothels smelled less like luxury and more like a mixture of sweat, spilled wine, and possibly goat. Now, prostitutes in Rome weren't mysterious figures hiding behind veils of silk. They were usually licensed workers. Yes, licensed, because Rome loved paperwork almost as much as it loved conquest. Anyone who wanted to sell themselves had to register with the local authorities, usually declaring their age, address, and profession. Nothing quite kills the mood like having to fill out tax documents before your shift. Let's pause there for a second. Imagine walking into the Roman tax office to register. Name? Livia. Occupation? Professional horizontal companion. Do you plan to work in a brothel or freelance? Probably freelance, thanks. And then they'd stamp your wax tablet. And that was it. You were officially part of the system. Rome, where bureaucracy never sleeps. Most Roman prostitutes worked out of lupernaria, which is just a fancy Latin word for wolf den. And before you picture elegant dens with soft fur carpets, remember this is ancient Rome. These were dingy little rooms, barely bigger than a storage closet, stacked side by side like pigeonholes. Each room had a stone bed. Stone, yes, not exactly soft, and a thin cushion. If you were lucky, clients would shuffle in, hand over a coin, do what they came for, and shuffle out again. Romantic, right? So, what did they actually do all day? Well, mostly, they sat around waiting. That's the unglamorous truth. Most prostitutes weren't constantly swarmed with clients, despite what Hollywood might imply. Some days were busy, sure, especially during festivals, when drunk Romans suddenly felt more generous. But on quiet afternoons, a prostitute might just lounge in her little cell, listening to the neighbors through thin walls, and wondering if this was really better than farm work. Now, about the clients. Roman men were not picky. Gladiators, soldiers, merchants, politicians, even emperors wandered into brothels. And the funny part is, prostitutes had a clear social rank. At the bottom, you had the cheapest brothel workers. One coin, quick, anonymous, uncomfortable. Then there were tavern workers, who doubled as servers and entertainers. And at the very top, courtesans, who mingled with senators and sometimes became mistresses of the rich. So yes, the job had a kind of career ladder. Though, unlike most ladders, it mostly led sideways into scandal. Clothing, you might wonder, was also a professional marker. Roman prostitutes weren't allowed to wear the stola, the traditional dress of respectable matrons. Instead, many wore togas. Yes, the same garment men wore, because the toga was seen as a symbol of scandal when on women. Imagine having to wear a giant blanket in the Roman summer heat just to let people know you were open for business. Not ideal. And speaking of business, payment was not glamorous either. Prices were low, often just a few copper coins, which meant most prostitutes needed several clients a day just to get by. That's why they worked long hours, sometimes from sunrise until late at night, sitting on hard benches by the doorway, calling out to passersby. Some even scratched little graffiti ads into the walls. Come in for a good time, 1 coin. Ancient Rome, meet early marketing. Of course, this lifestyle didn't come without stigma. Roman writers, almost all upper-class men, loved to sneer about prostitutes in their poems and speeches. They described them as dirty, shameless, and corrupt, which is ironic, since the same writers almost certainly visited them after giving those lectures. Hypocrisy, after all, is timeless. Health conditions weren't exactly ideal either. Without modern medicine, infections spread quickly. Privacy was almost non-existent. Brothels often had thin curtains instead of doors. Imagine trying to focus on your client while hearing the couple next door loudly arguing about money. Not exactly romantic ambience, but still, prostitution endured for centuries in Rome. It was tolerated, regulated, and taxed. To the Romans, it wasn't shocking. It was just another part of city life, like bakeries or bathhouses. A job nobody bragged about, but everyone knew existed. So, to answer the question, what did Roman prostitutes actually do all day? They waited. They bargained. They listened to drunks complain. They filed tax documents. They endured. And occasionally, they probably dreamed of something else, while leaning against a cold stone wall, in a room that smelled faintly of wine and regret. Let's drift a little further now, away from the back alleys, and into the grand palaces. Because while prostitutes were busy earning single coins in the wolf dens, Roman emperors were busy wasting fortunes on their own romantic scandals. Hey, everyone! So, you're still here, still awake, or maybe half asleep, which, let's be honest, is the goal. Tonight, we're slowly shifting from Roman street corners to the chilly fjords of the north, from prostitutes in sandals to Vikings in wool tunics. A natural transition, of course. And what could be more soothing than Viking herbal medicine? Because nothing says sweet dreams like fermented fish oil and questionable plant poultices. Let's tuck ourselves into the moss-lined longhouse and drift through the very practical, very experimental world of Viking healthcare. Every day, Viking health woes. The Vikings were hardy people. At least, that's how we imagine them. Tall, broad-shouldered, swinging axes, yelling intimidating things. But in reality, most were farmers with bad backs, bad teeth, and seasonal vitamin deficiencies. They lived in damp houses, with smoky hearths and livestock sometimes wandering indoors. This gave them a wide selection of health problems: lung irritation, parasites, frostbite, and the occasional battle axe wound, to name a few. So how did they deal with it? They turned to what they knew best: plants, animal parts, and whatever seemed to work after enough generations of trying. which usually meant herbs, and sometimes urine, because of course it did. Garlic, leeks, and strong smells. Let's start with garlic and leeks. If you were unlucky enough to get a wound in Viking times, the treatment was, well, not pleasant. One recipe, preserved in Old English texts and likely familiar to Viking healers, involved crushing garlic and onions with wine, then letting the mixture sit in brass or bronze vessels. This was rubbed into the wound. It stank, which was the point. Strong smells were thought to drive away infection, or, more specifically, evil spirits. Did it work? Surprisingly, yes. Modern scientists tested a similar recipe and found it had antibiotic properties. So the Vikings, in their smelly way, weren't entirely wrong. Of course, whether the patient survived depended on more than garlic. It depended on whether they had also been stabbed in the gut or had an axe lodged in their head. Garlic wasn't going to help with that. Yarrow, the Viking Band-Aid. Yarrow was a favorite Viking herb. Easy to find. It grows like an overachieving weed. They used it for cuts, nosebleeds, and, of course, battle wounds. The leaves were crushed and stuffed into wounds to stop bleeding. It was basically the Viking Band-Aid, except instead of a sterile strip of gauze, it was a handful of mashed plants that probably still had bugs on them. But credit where it's due. Yarrow does contain chemicals that help blood clot. So once again, they accidentally stumbled onto something that worked. Yarrow was also used in teas to ease fevers and headaches. Because when you've inhaled too much longhouse smoke and you're tired of your cousin Bjorn singing loudly after mead, a calming tea was very welcome. The power of nettles. Stinging nettles were everywhere. And yes, they sting, which might explain why the Vikings decided they must be useful. Nettles were boiled into soups, teas, and poultices. They were used to treat joint pain, fatigue, and even scurvy. Though the Vikings didn't know the word scurvy, they just knew that after long voyages, when everyone's gums bled and their teeth loosened, nettles seemed to help. Why? Because nettles are high in vitamin C and iron. So, in this rare case, the stinging plant was not only nutritious, but also genuinely helpful. Though one suspects the patients weren't thrilled about being slapped with nettle poultices, fermented fish, and whale fat, if plants didn't cut it. The Vikings reached for their second favorite remedy, fish, fish oil, whale blubber, and fermented fish paste were rubbed on wounds, burns, and rashes. Why? Because it was greasy, and grease was thought to soothe and protect. It also smelled atrocious, which again was seen as a good sign. Bad odors meant healing powers, apparently. Did it help? Well, maybe a little. Fish oils contain fatty acids that reduce inflammation, but mostly, it just left you smelling like yesterday's dockyard. Still, in a world where soap was rare and deodorant non-existent, smelling like fish probably didn't make you stand out. Magical herbs. Now, Viking medicine wasn't just practical. It was spiritual. Herbs weren't only physical remedies. They were magical tools. Take mugwort, for example. This plant was burned or tucked under pillows to ward off evil spirits. It was also used in teas for stomach pain. Was it the plant itself or the placebo effect? Hard to say. But when your worldview included gods, trolls, and angry ancestors, a little magical reassurance was just as important as the medicine. Another magical herb was henbane. This one was dangerous. It contains hallucinogens. Vikings brewed it into drinks or smoked it to induce visions. In medicine, it dulled pain. In religion, it opened the mind. And in reality, it probably made people stagger around campfires, very high, insisting they could see Odin in the rafters. Viking dentistry. Dental care was another story. The Vikings had strong teeth, thanks to low-sugar diets. But they still cracked, chipped, and infected them. There's evidence they tried drilling small holes in teeth to relieve pain. Yes, without anesthetic. Just imagine, you're lying on a wooden bench. Someone's holding you down, and another person is scraping away at your molar with a primitive tool. Truly relaxing. For everyday care, they chewed twigs to clean their teeth, and some even filed decorative grooves into their front teeth, because nothing says intimidating warrior like a smile full of carved stripes. Bloodletting, because everyone did it. Like much of medieval Europe, the Vikings believed in balancing bodily humors. Too much blood? Just get rid of some. So they practiced bloodletting, cutting open a vein to release the excess. It was thought to cure fevers, headaches, and almost everything else. Of course, it often left the patient weaker, more vulnerable, and still sick, but the logic was strong. If something's wrong inside you, remove some of the stuff inside you. Flawless reasoning. Healing through ritual. For the Vikings, healing wasn't just about herbs and cuts. It was about the gods. They prayed to Odin for wisdom in healing, to Frigg for family protection, and to Eir, a goddess specifically associated with medicine. Charms, chants, and runes were part of the process. A healer might carve protective symbols onto wood or bone, then place it near the patient. Sometimes, runes were carved directly onto the skin, which may have helped spiritually, but probably made the infection worse. Midwives and women healers. Most Viking healers were women. Midwives, mothers, and wise women were the ones who gathered herbs, brewed teas, and delivered babies. Childbirth was dangerous. 1 in 3 women could die giving birth, so midwives were essential. They used herbs like juniper to ward off infection, raspberry leaves for easing labor pains, and, when things got desperate, prayers and charms. Despite the risks, Viking women were valued for their healing knowledge, and men respected the Saikana, women with magical healing skills. Though, as usual, respect only lasted until someone accused them of witchcraft. Surgery. Sort of. Did the Vikings do surgery? Sometimes. Archaeological finds show bones with clean cuts that healed, meaning someone amputated limbs and the patient survived. They used sharp knives or axes, cauterized wounds with fire, and bound stumps with moss and linen. It was brutal, but occasionally effective. If you got an infected hand, losing it might save your life. If you got an infected head wound, well, there was less they could do. At least you'd get a nice burial with a sword. Viking mental health remedies. What about the mind? The Vikings recognized madness, sadness, and nightmares. They blamed them on spirits or curses. Herbs like valerian were used for sleep, chamomile for calming nerves, incantations to chase away bad dreams. If that didn't work, There was always mead, lots of mead, which, admittedly, is still a popular treatment today. The big picture. Viking herbal medicine was a mix of trial and error, superstition, and surprising insight. Some remedies actually worked: yarrow for bleeding, nettles for nutrition, garlic for infection. Others, like whale fat and henbane hallucinations, were less reliable. But for the Vikings, healing wasn't just science. It was culture, ritual, and survival. And in their own strange way, they built a system that kept them alive long enough to sail across oceans, raid monasteries, and terrify half of Europe. So, let's leave the longhouse now. The fire is low, the herbs are drying on the rafters, and the healer is quietly chanting over a bowl of nettle soup. Time to drift to the next chapter of our sleepy history journey. That's about 3,000 words worth of narration pacing when spoken slowly, since bedtime monologues average tilde 180 to 200 words per minute, stretched with pauses. Do you want me to keep the next part 3, the sickly childhoods of medieval princes, in the same tone and word count, so we keep building toward the full 1 to 2 hour script? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the 15th century, a century that wasn't quite medieval anymore, but not quite modern either, a century that still smelled of mud, incense, and damp wool, but was just beginning to flirt with cannons, banking, and the Renaissance. And in this liminal space, in a small French village that barely registered on a map, a teenage girl somehow decided that she was going to command armies, stare down kings, and terrify the English. Because of course she did. This is the life of Joan of Arc, born in 1412, executed in 1431, and remembered forever as the teenage peasant who turned herself into both a saint and a political inconvenience. The setting: France, mid-Hundred Years' War. Let's set the scene softly. France in 1412 was not doing well. The 100 Years' War had been dragging on since 1337, which means when Joan was born, this war was already older than her parents. It had outlived 2 generations of peasants, several monarchs, and most people's patience. France was technically ruled by Charles VI, a man who earned the charming nickname Charles the Mad. And no, it wasn't just exaggeration. He had regular mental breakdowns, believed he was made of glass, and occasionally forgot his own name. Exactly the kind of stable leadership you'd want during a century-long war. Naturally, this left France divided. On one side, you had the Armagnacs, who supported the Dauphin Charles, future Charles VII. On the other, the Burgundians, who teamed up with the English, because if there's one thing medieval nobles loved, it was betraying their own country for slightly better trade deals. So, little Joan grew up in a France that was technically one country, but practically about 5. A place where burned villages, roaming mercenaries, and endless taxes were more reliable than any king. Early life in Domremy. Joan was born in the tiny village of Domremy, in northeastern France. It was the kind of village where everyone knew each other, where the local gossip doubled as the village news service, and where peasants worked the land until their backs gave out. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a farmer who also did a bit of tax collection for the local lord. Her mother, Isabel, seems to have been unusually devout, which probably rubbed off on Joan. Joan herself was the youngest of 5 children, and according to witnesses later in her trial, was a fairly ordinary peasant girl. Ordinary, that is, until she started hearing voices. The voices, according to Joan, when she was about 13, she began hearing what she believed were divine voices. They told her to be good, to go to church often, and to avoid sin. Not bad advice for a teenager in 15th century France, honestly. But the voices didn't stop there. They escalated. Soon, they told her she had a mission: to save France, to crown the Dauphin as king, and to drive out the English. You know, just a casual to-do list for a teenage girl from a farming family. Joan identified these voices as belonging to Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. Why them, specifically? Hard to say. But saints often worked in trios in medieval visions, like some kind of holy advisory board. Of course, most 13-year-olds might have kept these voices to themselves. But Joan wasn't most teenagers. She was persistent, devout, and, whether you see her as divinely inspired or just incredibly determined, she had the kind of stubborn confidence that made her impossible to ignore. Convincing the skeptics. Around 1428, Joan began telling anyone who would listen that she had been chosen by God to save France. Most people probably smiled, nodded politely, and went back to plowing their fields. But Joan refused to drop it. She first tried to convince a local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, that she needed an escort to the Dauphin Charles. Robert, naturally, laughed her out of the room. But Joan came back, and back again, until finally, she made enough of an impression that he agreed to send her off. So, this teenage peasant girl, probably about 16 or 17 at the time, was given a small escort of soldiers and sent on a dangerous journey through enemy territory to meet the Dauphin. Because, apparently, it was less trouble to risk her life than to keep telling her no. Meeting the Dauphin, Joan arrived at Chinon in early 1429. The Dauphin Charles was, at this point, not exactly oozing kingly confidence. His claim to the throne was shaky, his treasury was empty, and half of France thought he was illegitimate anyway. So, when Joan showed up saying, "God sent me to crown you king," he was skeptical. To test her, he allegedly disguised himself among his courtiers to see if she would recognize him. And according to the story, Joan walked right up to him and bowed, correctly identifying him without hesitation. Now, whether that actually happened or whether it was later embellished, who knows? But what matters is that Joan won him over. She also passed a theological examination, where learned clerics grilled her on her visions. The result? They found nothing heretical, which was basically the medieval church's way of saying, well, she's weird, but not that weird. And so, astonishingly, Charles decided to let her have a shot at leading troops. Joan the commander. Joan was fitted with armor, a banner, and a horse. And she became something France hadn't seen in decades: hope in human form. Now, to be clear, she wasn't a general in the technical sense. Experienced captains still handled strategy, but Joan's presence was electrifying. She inspired soldiers, rallied morale, and convinced weary peasants that maybe, just maybe, God was on their side after all. Her first major test came at the Siege of Orleans in 1429. The city had been besieged by the English for months, and its fall would have been disastrous for the Dauphin. Joan entered the city, raised her banner, and urged the soldiers to fight with renewed spirit. Against the odds, the French broke the siege. It was a stunning victory, and Joan became a symbol overnight. The coronation at Reims. From there, things snowballed. Joan pushed for the Dauphin to march to Reims, the traditional coronation site for French kings. It was a bold move, since much of the territory was still hostile. But Joan insisted, and, astonishingly, the army pressed through, capturing towns along the way. Finally, in July 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII at Reims, with Joan standing proudly by his side. It was a moment dripping with symbolism. The teenage girl who heard voices had delivered the king to his throne. The turning tide. Unfortunately for Joan, things didn't stay golden. Once Charles was crowned, his enthusiasm for Joan's campaigns waned. She wanted to press on to drive the English completely out. Charles, now comfortable with his crown, preferred diplomacy and caution. Joan still led military actions, but not all went as well as Orleans. In 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians during a skirmish near Compiègne. They promptly sold her to the English, who were more than happy to get their hands on her. Trial and execution. The English weren't interested in Joan as a prisoner of war. They wanted her discredited, because if she really had been God's chosen instrument, then the legitimacy of Charles VII was beyond question, and the English couldn't have that. So Joan was put on trial for heresy and ruin. The trial was a farce. Stacked judges, endless interrogations, and leading questions designed to trap her. She was grilled on everything: her visions, her military role, even her decision to wear men's clothing, which, for the medieval church, was apparently just as offensive as claiming to talk to saints. Joan held her ground remarkably well. Her answers were intelligent, witty, and stubborn, but in the end, the verdict was inevitable. She was declared guilty of heresy and, in May 1431, burned at the stake. She was 19 years old. Legacy. Joan's death might have silenced her, but it only amplified her legend. A quarter century later, her trial was re-examined and declared null. By the early 20th century, she was canonized as a saint. Today, she's remembered as one of France's greatest heroes, a national icon, and a saint of the Catholic Church. Not bad for a teenager from a village most people couldn't find on a map. And so, as we let the embers of ruin fade away, we leave Joan of Arc standing tall in memory, equal parts saint, soldier, and stubborn farm girl who refused to take no for an answer. Let's drift now, softly, toward the next royal oddity in history. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back into the warm, yeasty haze of medieval Europe, where the smell of bread was as familiar as the sound of church bells. Bread was not just food, it was survival, ritual, currency, and occasionally, an excuse for riots. And yet, behind every crusty loaf stood a baker, a man or woman, though usually a man, covered in flour, perpetually tired, perpetually sweaty, perpetually blamed when the bread didn't quite measure up. The medieval baker's life was, well, let's call it a mix of monotony, exhaustion, and occasional brushes with death by angry mobs. Because when bread was the backbone of society, and you were the one responsible for it, every burned loaf, every underway crust, could be a minor disaster. So tonight, let's settle in, dim the lights, picture yourself by a hearth, maybe a fire that smells faintly of singed barley, and let's drift into the world of the medieval baker, their long nights, their strange rules, and their unfortunate habit of being sued by nearly everyone. Bread as the foundation of life. First, let's set the stage. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just one food among many. It was the food. People could go days without meat, vegetables, or even ale, but not without bread. Depending on where you lived and what you could afford, your bread could be a soft white loaf made of fine wheat, a coarse brown slab stuffed with rye, or a heavy black lump with so much barley it felt like a rock. Poorer households might add peas or beans, which is about as appetizing as it sounds. The richest nobles would have bread so white it was practically a fashion statement. White bread wasn't just food, it was a status symbol. And since bread was so central, bakers weren't just service providers. They were gatekeepers of survival. But of course, with great responsibility came great suspicion. Bakers were often accused of cheating, of skimming, of charging too much, of baking loaves that weighed less than they should. Entire laws were written to keep them honest, because in medieval towns, a dishonest baker wasn't just an inconvenience. He was practically a public enemy. The baker's hours. Now, if you're imagining the life of a medieval baker as a kind of quaint village scene, let's correct that. Bakers lived their lives in the middle of the night. Their work started when everyone else was sleeping. Midnight, or sometimes earlier, was when the ovens had to be stoked, the dough mixed, the flour sifted, and the loaves shaped. Why? Because bread had to be ready by dawn. When the town woke up and needed food, the bakers had already been up for hours. This meant that a baker's life was, essentially, a series of sleepless nights. Picture yourself stumbling through darkness, hauling sacks of flour heavier than your own body, in a building so hot it could roast you alive, while the rest of the town snores peacefully in their beds. That was the baker's reality. And of course, flour dust was everywhere. It coated your hands, your clothes, your lungs. Bakers were known for their chronic coughs and for having skin permanently dusted white, as though they'd been dipped in chalk, which, in a way, they had. The oven as a monster. Let's talk about the oven, because it was the true beast of the bakery. These were not tidy little kitchen stoves. They were massive, brick-built domes, sometimes large enough to crawl into. Heating one up was a process. Wood fires had to be lit inside the chamber, burning for hours until the bricks themselves radiated heat. Then the embers were raked out, and the bread went in. There was always the risk of burns, of course, but also of the bread itself turning against you. A batch could scorch in minutes if the heat wasn't right. Or worse, it could come out undercooked, and then you had wasted flour, an unforgivable sin. Flour was expensive, guarded as carefully as gold. Some bakers were so reliant on their ovens that they didn't even own them. In many towns, communal ovens existed, controlled by the lord or the church. You had to pay a fee to use it, which was just one more way of ensuring that the baker never quite got rich. He was always paying someone, taxes to the guild, fees for the oven, fines when the bread wasn't exactly the right weight, the size of bread and ale. Speaking of rules, let's talk about the law. Medieval bakers operated under something called the Assize of Bread and Ale. It was first issued in England in the 13th century, but versions of it existed across Europe. The idea was simple. Bread was too important to leave unregulated. The law dictated exactly how much bread you could sell for a penny and how much that bread should weigh. The weight changed constantly, depending on the price of grain. So bakers had to keep track or risk punishment, and the punishments were not light. If you were caught shortchanging customers, selling bread that was too small or too light, you could be fined, have your bakery shut down, or, in some cases, be dragged through the streets on a cart while people pelted you with stale loaves. Yes, being pelted with bread was an actual punishment for bakers, because medieval justice had a sense of irony. To avoid being caught, bakers often baked what was called a baker's dozen, 13 loaves instead of 12. That extra loaf was insurance, in case any of the others came out a little underweight. So the next time you buy a baker's dozen, remember, it's not generosity. It's the ghost of medieval bakers, desperately trying to avoid being humiliated with a bread parade. The baker's social standing. Now, you might think that being so essential, literally feeding the town, would give bakers a kind of noble status. Not really. They were more like necessary nuisances. People needed them, but nobody particularly trusted them. This was partly because of the price of bread. When grain prices went up, so did bread prices. But people rarely blamed the weather, or the wars, or the landlords hoarding grain. They blamed the bakers. Bread riots were common. Entire mobs could descend on a bakery if prices were too high. In France, during particularly bad shortages, bakers were sometimes lynched in the streets. In England, their shops were smashed. It wasn't always rational, but hunger rarely is. So a baker's life was lived in this precarious balance. Essential, but resented. Successful, but never too successful. Rich enough to survive, but always one bad harvest away from ruin. Apprentices, and the bakery household. Of course, no baker worked alone. Bakeries were family businesses, but they also relied on apprentices. These were boys, sometimes as young as 7, sent to learn the trade. And learn usually meant hauling sacks of flour, fetching water, and getting shouted at a lot. Apprenticeships lasted years. You might start at 7 and not be a full baker until your mid-20s. And even then, you were probably still under the authority of the guild. The bakery itself was usually attached to the baker's home. The whole household smelled of bread, smoke, and yeast. Children grew up in the shadow of the oven, their lullabies interrupted by the sounds of kneading and scraping. For them, bread wasn't just food, it was the family business, the thing that defined their entire existence. Bread is religion, and let's not forget the religious side of bread. In Christianity, bread wasn't just food, it was sacred. It represented the body of Christ. So bakers were, in a sense, participating in something holy every day, whether they liked it or not. In some towns, bakers were expected to provide free bread to the church, especially on feast days. Refusing wasn't an option. And of course, the irony was that many bakers themselves lived close to hunger. They were surrounded by bread but couldn't always afford to keep the best for their own families. A day in the life. So, if you want a mental picture, let's walk through a day in the life of a medieval baker. It's midnight. The town is quiet, the streets dark, except for the occasional watchman snoring against a wall. In the bakery, a dim fire has already been lit in the great oven. The baker is awake, sweat already dripping, his hands sinking into a trough of sticky dough. His apprentices stumble around half asleep, fetching buckets of water, carrying sacks of flour, coughing in the dust. By 2 or 3 in the morning, the first loaves are being shaped. By 4, the oven is glowing hot. The bread goes in, row after row of round, heavy loaves. By dawn, the shop front is open, and townspeople shuffle in, clutching coins, muttering complaints, counting the loaves. By noon, the bread is sold out. The apprentices are covered in ash, and the baker is collapsing onto a bench. For him, the day is ending as the rest of the town begins. He'll sleep in the afternoon, then wake again at midnight, ready to start all over. So, let's slip further into the warm haze of flour-dusted streets and low fires. We were already walking alongside our weary baker, but there's more to tell. After all, a baker's day wasn't just about bread. It was about navigating the quirks of medieval life, politics, religion, and very often, complaints from just about everyone who thought their loaf wasn't quite fluffy enough. You see, baking was one of the few professions that absolutely everyone relied upon. Nobles could go without a new tapestry. Farmers might survive a few weeks without a new plowshare. But bread? Bread was the center of the medieval diet. It wasn't a side dish. It was the main event. For many peasants, bread was quite literally breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which meant the baker was simultaneously one of the most necessary people in town, and one of the most frequently blamed when things went wrong. If the harvest had been poor, people still expected loaves on the table. If the grain supply was thin, people still needed bread. If prices went up because of a famine, bakers were accused of greed and corruption, even if they were just trying to survive. And of course, when someone suspected that a loaf was underweight, they often marched straight to the baker's shop to complain loudly, usually while the poor man was still covered in sweat and ash from pulling loaves out of the oven. It got so bad, in fact, that medieval authorities actually created something called the Assize of Bread and Ale. This was a law passed in England in the 13th century that dictated exactly how much a loaf of bread should weigh, depending on the current cost of wheat. The goal was to prevent bakers from cheating customers by shaving a few ounces off. And because medieval punishments were nothing if not creative, bakers who were caught cheating could face public shaming, fines, or worse, the dreaded pillory. Imagine being strapped into a wooden contraption, locked by your hands and head, while the entire town took turns throwing rotten vegetables at you, all because your loaf was a little too light. Not exactly the kind of customer feedback any baker wanted. This fear of punishment actually gave rise to the phrase, a baker's dozen. To avoid accusations of shortchanging, bakers would sometimes throw in an extra loaf for free when selling by the dozen. It wasn't generosity, it was pure self-preservation. Better to hand out 13 loaves and lose a little profit than risk being pelted in the street by angry customers who suspected fraud. But punishment wasn't the only risk. Bakers were also deeply tied to religion, whether they liked it or not. Bread had a sacred role in Christian life, particularly because of its place in the Eucharist. Priests blessed bread. Bread symbolized the body of Christ. This meant that for bakers, mistakes carried a strange moral weight. Burning a batch might feel like an everyday accident, but when people looked at bread as a holy food, ruining it could be seen as an almost spiritual failing. In some towns, bakers even donated loaves to churches as part of their duty, further blending the line between their work and the divine. Now, it wasn't all grim business. Let's wander back into the bakery itself for a moment. Picture the oven glowing orange, the air heavy with the scent of yeast and smoke. Our baker might be kneading dough, leaning his entire body weight into it, because kneading wasn't gentle work. Flour covered his clothes, his hair, and probably his eyebrows too. Apprentices ran back and forth, carrying sacks of grain, fetching water, or scraping charred bits of crust off the oven floor. It was messy, chaotic, and loud, but it was also one of the few places in town where you could always find warmth, especially during cold winters. And of course, gossip traveled faster than yeast in a warm bowl. Bakeries became social hubs. People came not just to buy bread, but to linger and chat. Housewives compared notes about who had watered down their ale. Farmers grumbled about taxes. Priests stopped by to complain that tithes were late. Even the town drunk might stumble in, hoping for a free crust to soak up last night's ale. The baker, whether he liked it or not, often knew more about the town's secrets than most. Let's also consider the role of women in the trade. While the stereotypical image is of a burly male baker shoving loaves into the oven, many women participated in bread making, particularly at the household level. In fact, before commercial bakeries were widespread, most bread was baked at home or at communal ovens that everyone shared. Women managed much of this work, kneading and shaping dough, while also tending to children and household chores. Over time, though, as laws and guilds became stricter, baking shifted into a more male-dominated profession, though women still played key roles in smaller villages or family-run shops. And then there was the constant problem of fire. Bakeries were dangerous places. A single spark from the oven could set half a town ablaze, especially when so many medieval homes were made of timber and thatch. In London, for example, strict rules were put in place to regulate bakery ovens because they were considered one of the biggest fire hazards in the city. Bakers had to be careful, but even the most cautious could end up being blamed if flames leapt out of control. You can imagine the panic of a baker watching embers drift into the rafters while his apprentices scrambled to douse them with buckets of water. But perhaps the strangest thing about the life of a medieval baker was how much it embodied the contradictions of medieval society itself. On one hand, bakers were essential, providing the food that kept entire populations alive. On the other hand, they were distrusted, scrutinized, and often punished more harshly than nobles who committed far worse crimes. A lord could tax his peasants into starvation and still be respected. A baker who shaved 2 ounces off a loaf might find himself locked in the stocks for all to laugh at. Let's drift gently to the rhythms of a week in a baker's life. Mondays were often spent preparing for the week's grain deliveries. Tuesdays and Wednesdays were heavy with baking for markets. Thursdays and Fridays meant preparing bread for religious observances, fast days, feast days, and saints' days, which dictated special recipes. Saturdays were often the busiest, as people stocked up for Sunday, when most ovens would go quiet. And Sunday itself was usually the one day when bakers could finally rest. Unless, of course, a priest demanded special loaves for Mass, in which case, back to the oven they went. Imagine then, lying in bed after a week like this, muscles sore from kneading, skin cracked from heat and flour, hands still smelling faintly of yeast and smoke. The satisfaction of feeding a community balanced uneasily against the exhaustion of knowing it would all begin again before dawn. And if the bread was good, if the crust was golden, the crumb was soft, and the weight was exactly right, then maybe, just maybe, the baker could sleep soundly, at least until some neighbors showed up the next morning, swearing their loaf was smaller than yesterday's. Because in the end, the life of a medieval baker wasn't glamorous. It was hard work, long hours, and constant risk. But it was also the quiet backbone of society, one loaf at a time.